The date was August 15th, 1945. After years of brutal occupation under Imperial Japan, the Korean peninsula should have been celebrating liberation and unity. Instead, two young American colonels sat in a cramped Pentagon office with a National Geographic map and a single urgent task: divide Korea. Dean Rusk and Charles Bonesteel had 30 minutes to recommend a dividing line before their superiors met with Soviet representatives. They chose the 38th parallel, an arbitrary geographic marker that split the peninsula roughly in half. Neither man had ever set foot in Korea. Neither spoke Korean. Neither understood that their hasty decision would create a fracture that would bring the world to the brink of nuclear annihilation within 5 years. Korea had endured 35 years of Japanese colonial rule, a period marked by cultural suppression, forced labor, and systematic attempts to erase Korean identity itself. The Korean people had resisted throughout, forming independence movements both within the peninsula and in exile. When Japan surrendered following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Koreans across the political spectrum expected to finally reclaim their sovereignty. Instead, they found themselves caught between two emerging superpowers, who saw the peninsula not as a nation deserving independence, but as a strategic prize in an ideological contest that was already beginning to define the post-war world. The decision to split Korea at the 38th parallel was presented as a temporary administrative measure. Soviet forces would accept the Japanese surrender north of the line, while American forces would do the same in the south. This division was supposed to last only until a unified Korean government could be established. But the temporary became permanent as the wartime alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union collapsed into mutual suspicion and hostility. What Americans would call the Cold War was heating up rapidly, and Korea found itself transformed from a unified nation under foreign occupation into two separate zones, reflecting the deepening global divide between capitalism and communism. The arbitrary nature of the 38th parallel cannot be overstated. It had no historical significance in Korean culture or politics. It divided families, split communities, and cut through the middle of provinces that had been administratively and culturally unified for centuries. The line separated the industrial north, which had been developed by the Japanese for heavy manufacturing and mining, from the agricultural south. Neither region could function effectively as an independent economic unit. The division made no sense from a Korean perspective, but it made perfect sense within the logic of great power competition. The Soviet Union wanted a buffer state on its eastern frontier. The United States wanted to contain communist expansion in Asia. Korea's fate would be determined by this clash, not by the wishes of the Korean people themselves. In the north, Soviet occupation authorities quickly moved to establish a communist system. They empowered local communist leaders and began implementing land reforms and nationalization of industry. The Soviets found a useful partner in Kim Il-sung, a young guerrilla fighter who had battled the Japanese from bases in Manchuria and the Soviet Far East. Kim had spent the final years of World War II serving in the Soviet Army, and Soviet authorities saw him as reliable and ideologically committed. By 1946, Soviet occupation officials had maneuvered Kim into the leadership of the emerging North Korean state. Kim proved to be more than a Soviet puppet, however. He harbored genuine nationalist ambitions and dreams of reunifying Korea under his leadership, goals that would eventually make him willing to take enormous risks. The American occupation of South Korea followed a markedly different trajectory, though it was equally shaped by Cold War considerations. American military authorities initially struggled to find reliable Korean partners. Many nationalist leaders had leftist leanings that made them suspect in American eyes, while conservatives often had histories of collaboration with the Japanese occupation that tainted their legitimacy among ordinary Koreans. The United States eventually settled on Syngman Rhee, a Korean independence activist who had spent decades in American exile. Rhee was staunchly anti-communist and pro-American, but he was also autocratic, intolerant of opposition, and disconnected from conditions on the ground in Korea after his long absence. Like Kim in the north, Rhee was committed to reunification, but on his own terms and under his own leadership. By 1948, it had become clear that the temporary division would not be resolved through negotiation or elections. The United Nations, then still largely dominated by the United States and its allies, called for nationwide elections to establish a unified Korean government. The Soviet Union and North Korean authorities refused to participate, recognizing that such elections would likely favor the more populous South. Instead, separate elections were held in each zone. In August 1948, the Republic of Korea was formally established in the South, with Syngman Rhee as president. The following month, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea was proclaimed in the North, with Kim Il-sung as premier. Two Korean states now existed, where one had stood for centuries, each claiming to be the sole legitimate government of the entire peninsula, each backed by a superpower patron, each viewing the other as illegitimate and temporary. The withdrawal of occupation forces seemed to reduce tensions at first glance, but it actually created a more dangerous situation. Soviet troops withdrew from North Korea by the end of 1948, and American combat forces left South Korea by mid-1949, leaving behind only a small military advisory group. But both superpowers had armed their respective Korean clients, creating two hostile armies facing each other across the 38th parallel, with minimal direct superpower oversight. Border clashes became routine throughout 1949, with both sides conducting raids, skirmishes, and probing attacks. The peninsula had become a powder keg, and both Korean leaders were playing with matches, each convinced that the other side would collapse quickly if pushed hard enough. The global context made Korea even more volatile. In October 1949, the communist victory in the Chinese Civil War created the People's Republic of China, transforming Asia's geopolitical landscape. Suddenly, communist states stretched from Central Europe through China to the Korean peninsula. American policymakers saw a coordinated communist offensive directed from Moscow. The Soviet Union's successful test of an atomic bomb in August 1949 ended the American nuclear monopoly and raised the stakes of any potential confrontation. Meanwhile, American policy in Asia remained uncertain. Secretary of State Dean Acheson's public definition of America's defensive perimeter in the Pacific in January 1950 seemed to exclude South Korea, a statement that may have signaled to Moscow and Pyongyang that the United States would not intervene in a Korean conflict. Kim Il-sung began seriously planning to reunify Korea by force in early 1949, making multiple trips to Moscow to secure Soviet support. Stalin was initially cautious, reluctant to risk a confrontation with the United States over Korea. But the geopolitical shifts of 1949 changed his calculus. The communist victory in China provided a potential ally and buffer. The Soviet atomic bomb reduced American strategic advantages. Acheson's speech suggested limited American commitment to South Korea. When Kim traveled to Moscow in April 1950, Stalin gave his approval for an invasion, though he remained cautious about direct Soviet involvement. Stalin also insisted that Kim secure support from Mao Zedong and the new Chinese Communist government. Mao gave his reluctant consent in May, though he was focused on consolidating power at home and planning to invade Taiwan. The stage was now set for a conflict that all parties involved expected to be brief and decisive, but which would instead become a grinding meat grinder that nearly ignited World War III. Korea mattered in 1950 for reasons that transcended the peninsula itself. It represented a test of American credibility and the principle of containing communist expansion. It demonstrated whether the United Nations could function as a collective security organization or was merely a debating society. It showed whether communist states would pursue revolutionary expansion through armed force or accept existing boundaries. The division of Korea was never simply a local issue or a civil war between rival Korean factions. From the moment those two American colonels drew a line on a map in 1945, Korea was embedded in global power struggles. The Korean people themselves had little say in their fate. They were divided by decisions made in Washington and Moscow, armed by those same powers, and then left to fight a proxy war that would devastate their peninsula and nearly drag the world into nuclear war. The arbitrary line drawn in 30 minutes would be defended with millions of lives over 3 years of savage combat. The invasion began at dawn on June 25, 1950. Along the entire length of the 38th parallel, North Korean artillery batteries opened fire simultaneously in a carefully coordinated barrage. Within minutes, thousands of shells were raining down on South Korean positions. Then came the ground assault. 7 North Korean infantry divisions, supported by Soviet-made T-34 tanks, crashed through the thinly defended border in multiple locations. The South Korean army, poorly equipped and unprepared for an offensive of this scale, crumbled within hours. The Korean People's Army had trained for this moment for months. They advanced with speed and aggression, utilizing tactics learned from Soviet advisors and tested in recent border clashes. The attack was no spontaneous border incident or gradual escalation. It was a full-scale invasion designed to reunify the peninsula by force before the United States could effectively respond. South Korea's military situation was desperate from the outset. The Republic of Korea Army numbered roughly 95,000 men, but many were poorly trained recruits. They had no tanks to counter the North Korean armor, limited artillery, and virtually no air force. South Korean forces along the border were configured for defensive operations against raids, not for repelling a major invasion supported by tanks and massive artillery preparation. Communication systems broke down almost immediately, leaving South Korean commanders uncertain about the scope of the attack and unable to coordinate an effective response. Units that tried to stand and fight were bypassed and encircled. Others retreated in disorder, abandoning equipment and positions. The North Korean plan called for reaching Seoul, the South Korean capital just 35 miles south of the 38th parallel, within 3 days. They achieved that objective almost exactly on schedule. President Syngman Rhee's government evacuated Seoul on June 27th, just 2 days after the invasion began. In their haste to escape, South Korean officials ordered the destruction of bridges over the Han River before all military units and thousands of civilians could cross, trapping many on the north side and creating scenes of chaos and desperation. The fall of Seoul was both a military disaster and a psychological blow. The capital's capture was broadcast internationally, creating an impression of total North Korean victory and South Korean collapse. Refugees flooded southward, clogging roads and making military movement even more difficult. North Korean forces showed no signs of slowing. They continued pushing south, aiming to complete the conquest of the entire peninsula before international intervention could materialize. Within a week of the invasion, North Korean forces had advanced over 100 miles and controlled virtually all territory north of the Han River. The international response developed rapidly, but not rapidly enough to prevent the initial catastrophe. News of the invasion reached Washington on Saturday evening, June 24th, due to time zone differences. President Harry Truman was at his home in Independence, Missouri. He immediately returned to Washington and convened emergency meetings with his top advisors. The Truman administration faced a critical decision. The United States had no treaty obligation to defend South Korea. American troops had been withdrawn from the peninsula the previous year. Secretary of State Acheson had publicly excluded Korea from America's defensive perimeter just months earlier. Some advisors argued that South Korea was strategically peripheral and not worth American lives. But Truman and most of his senior officials saw Korea differently. They viewed the invasion through the lens of the 1930s, when democratic nations failed to confront fascist aggression early, leading eventually to World War II. They believed that failing to resist communist aggression in Korea would invite further attacks elsewhere, perhaps in Europe or the Middle East. Truman ordered American air and naval forces into action on June 27th, authorizing them to support South Korean forces and attack North Korean positions. He also took the issue to the United Nations Security Council. In a crucial piece of timing, the Soviet Union was boycotting the Security Council at that moment to protest the UN's refusal to seat Communist China in place of the defeated nationalist government. This meant the Soviets could not veto Security Council action. On June 25th, the Security Council passed a resolution condemning the North Korean invasion and calling for a withdrawal. On June 27th, with the Soviet chair still empty, the Council passed another resolution recommending that UN members provide assistance to South Korea to repel the attack. This gave American intervention a UN mandate, and transformed what might have been a unilateral American war into a United Nations police action, though the United States would provide the vast majority of forces and exercise overall command. American ground forces entered combat in early July, and they fared no better initially than the South Koreans. The first American unit committed was Task Force Smith, an understrength battalion from the 24th Infantry Division stationed in occupied Japan. These troops had been enjoying comfortable occupation duty, and neither their training nor their equipment prepared them for combat against a determined enemy with tank support. On July 5th, Task Force Smith took up defensive positions near Osan, south of Seoul, hoping to block the North Korean advance. When North Korean T-34 tanks appeared, American forces discovered that their light anti-tank weapons could not penetrate the Soviet-made armor. The North Koreans attacked frontally while simultaneously enveloping the American positions. Task Force Smith suffered heavy casualties and retreated in disorder, leaving behind equipment and wounded. It was a humiliating introduction to combat and a harbinger of difficult weeks ahead. Throughout July, American and South Korean forces conducted a desperate fighting retreat down the Korean peninsula. More American units poured in from Japan, but they were rushed into action piecemeal and struggled against North Korean forces that were well-trained, well-equipped, and tactically proficient. American advantages in air power and naval gunfire could slow the North Korean advance, but not stop it. Every defensive line established by UN forces was outflanked or penetrated. Cities and towns changed hands as the front line swept southward. Casualties mounted steadily. By late July, UN forces had been pushed into the southeast corner of the peninsula, defending a shrinking perimeter around the port city of Pusan. This became known as the Pusan Perimeter, a rectangular defensive zone roughly 100 miles long and 50 miles wide. It was the last toehold of South Korea that remained unconquered, and if it fell, North Korea would control the entire peninsula. The Pusan Perimeter represented both a crisis and an opportunity. North Korean forces had advanced hundreds of miles in just weeks, but they had outrun their supply lines and suffered significant casualties. Their initial advantage in numbers and equipment had eroded. Meanwhile, UN forces continued to build up strength within the perimeter. Reinforcements arrived by sea at Pusan Port, immune to North Korean interdiction. American air power now operated from secure bases and dominated the skies, attacking North Korean supply lines and troop concentrations. The North Korean offensive was losing momentum just as UN defensive strength peaked. Throughout August, North Korean forces launched repeated attacks against the perimeter, trying to break through before UN strength became overwhelming. These attacks were fierce and sometimes penetrated deep into UN lines, but each was eventually contained and repelled. The Pusan Perimeter held, barely, through some of the most intense fighting of the entire war. While the battle for the Pusan Perimeter raged, General Douglas MacArthur was planning a dramatic counterstroke. MacArthur, the 70-year-old Supreme Commander of UN forces in Korea, was a controversial figure with an enormous ego and an undeniable strategic imagination. He had commanded American forces in the Southwest Pacific during World War II and presided over the occupation of Japan since 1945. MacArthur saw the desperate fighting at Pusan as a sideshow. He believed the key to victory was an amphibious landing deep behind North Korean lines that would cut their supply lines and trap their army in the south. MacArthur had the perfect target in mind: Inchon, the port city that served Seoul and sat on Korea's west coast, more than 100 miles behind the current front lines. An Inchon landing would be a strategic knockout blow, but it was also extraordinarily risky. The harbor had some of the worst tidal conditions in the world, with tides varying by more than 30 feet, and leaving the harbor approaches as mudflats during low tide. The few landing beaches were backed by seawalls and urban terrain. Navy and Marine planners initially considered the operation nearly impossible, but MacArthur overrode their objections with his characteristic certainty. The invasion would proceed on September 15, 1950. The transformation of the Korean War from a local invasion into a global crisis was complete by early September. What had begun as a seemingly successful North Korean blitzkrieg had evolved into a grinding attritional battle with American and United Nations forces fully committed. The Soviet Union provided equipment and advisors to North Korea, but remained officially uninvolved. Those Soviet pilots secretly began flying missions in Chinese-marked aircraft later in the war. China watched nervously as American forces approached its border, but had not yet intervened. The Truman administration portrayed Korea as a test of collective security and resolve against communist aggression. Communist propaganda presented the war as American imperialism resisting Korean national liberation. Across the world, nations took sides based on their Cold War alignments. The UN command eventually included forces from 16 nations beyond the United States and South Korea, though American forces always predominated. The conflict that was supposed to be finished in weeks had become an international war with no clear end in sight, and both sides were preparing escalations that would raise the stakes even higher. The landing at Inchon on September 15, 1950, was one of the most audacious amphibious operations in military history. The invasion force consisted of 75,000 men, primarily the 1st Marine Division and the 7th Infantry Division, supported by a naval armada of over 260 ships. They would have to land during a very brief window when the extreme tides made the approaches navigable, hit beaches backed by sea walls in the middle of an urban area, and do all of this against an enemy that, if alerted, could rush reinforcements to the landing site. The entire operation balanced on a knife edge of timing and surprise. MacArthur observed from the command ship Mount McKinley, confident in his plan despite the nearly unanimous skepticism of his subordinates. As dawn broke on September 15th, the invasion began with a preliminary assault on Volmi-do, a fortified island controlling Inchon harbor. Marines stormed ashore and quickly overwhelmed the surprised North Korean defenders. Then came the long wait for evening high tide, when the main landings could proceed. The main assault waves hit the beaches at Inchon just before sunset. Marines scaled the seawalls using ladders, fighting through initial resistance from stunned North Korean defenders who had not expected an attack in such an unlikely location. The gamble paid off spectacularly. North Korean forces in the area were minimal, and those present were quickly overcome. Within 24 hours, UN forces controlled Inchon and were pushing inland towards Seoul. The North Korean command structure, focused entirely on destroying the Pusan Perimeter to the south, suddenly faced a catastrophic threat to their rear. Supply lines running down the peninsula were severed almost immediately. North Korean forces at Pusan found themselves trapped between the perimeter defenders and the forces advancing from Inchon, fighting on two fronts with dwindling ammunition and fuel. The recapture of Seoul took longer and proved bloodier than the Inchon landing itself. The city had been fortified by North Korean forces determined to hold the symbolic capital. Fighting devolved into brutal street-to-street and building-to-building combat that reduced parts of the city to rubble. Marines and army units had to clear barricades, flush out snipers, and overcome strong points in urban terrain that favored defenders. The battle for Seoul lasted nearly 2 weeks, but the outcome was never in doubt once UN forces committed to the assault. On September 29th, less than 3 months after fleeing in panic, President Syngman Rhee returned to his capital. MacArthur staged an elaborate ceremony restoring Rhee to power in Seoul, though fighting was still ongoing in parts of the city. The symbolism mattered more than the tactical reality. South Korea had been saved from conquest. The North Korean invasion had been reversed. The question now was what came next. North Korean forces were in full retreat, disintegrating as organized formations. The Pusan Perimeter defenders broke out and drove north, linking up with the forces advancing from Inchon. Thousands of North Korean soldiers were killed, captured, or cut off and forced to flee into the mountains to wage guerrilla warfare. The North Korean People's Army, which had seemed unstoppable in June, was shattered by October. UN forces reached the 38th parallel, the original dividing line, in early October. They now faced a momentous decision. Should they halt at the 38th parallel, having achieved the original war aim of restoring South Korean sovereignty? Or should they continue north, pursuing the retreating North Korean forces and potentially reunifying Korea under UN auspices? The United States had entered the war to repel aggression, but the stunning success at Inchon created an opportunity to eliminate the North Korean state entirely and solve the Korea problem permanently. The decision to cross the 38th parallel and invade North Korea was made in Washington, not in Tokyo, though MacArthur strongly supported it and would later claim credit. The Truman administration saw multiple reasons to continue the offensive. Stopping at the 38th parallel would leave the aggressive Kim Il-sung regime in power, ready to invade again once it rebuilt. The opportunity to reunify Korea under a democratic government might never come again. Domestic political pressures also played a role, as Republican critics accused the Truman administration of being soft on communism. In late September, the Joint Chiefs of Staff authorized MacArthur to conduct operations north of the 38th parallel, subject to certain conditions. He should not cross if there was indication of major Soviet or Chinese intervention, and no non-Korean forces should approach the Chinese or Soviet borders. The United Nations General Assembly passed a resolution on October 7th calling for a unified, independent, and democratic Korea, effectively endorsing the invasion. The first South Korean units crossed the 38th parallel on October 1st. American forces followed on October 7th. The war for reunification had begun. The advance into North Korea proceeded with shocking speed. Organized North Korean resistance had largely collapsed. The North Korean capital of Pyongyang fell on October 19th to UN forces who met minimal opposition. MacArthur flew into the captured city and established his headquarters there, confidently predicting that the war would be over by Christmas, and American troops would be home shortly thereafter. UN forces raced northward, with different columns competing to reach the Yalu River, which formed the border with China. South Korean units reached the river in late October. The complete conquest of North Korea seemed imminent. MacArthur's reputation reached its zenith. The Inchon landing had been a triumph, and now total victory appeared within grasp. The general who had accepted Japan's surrender in 1945 would deliver another devastating defeat to communism in Asia. But the rapid advance masked growing dangers that MacArthur either ignored or dismissed. China had been sending increasingly urgent warnings that it would not tolerate American forces on its border. Chinese Foreign Minister Zhou Enlai stated publicly that China would intervene if non-Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel. Through intermediaries, including the Indian ambassador to Beijing, China communicated that it viewed the UN advance into North Korea as a threat to Chinese security. MacArthur regarded these warnings as bluffs, believing that China was too weak and too absorbed with domestic reconstruction to risk war with the United States. American intelligence assets were focused on detecting a Soviet intervention and largely discounted the possibility of Chinese action. The few intelligence reports suggesting a Chinese buildup in Manchuria were dismissed or minimized. MacArthur continued pushing north, even splitting his forces and sending them up different axes of advance, despite the mountainous terrain that prevented mutual support between separated columns. China had actually been preparing to intervene for weeks. Mao Zedong and the Chinese leadership engaged in intense debates throughout September and early October about whether to enter the war. The arguments against intervention were substantial. China had only recently emerged from decades of civil war and Japanese occupation. The economy was shattered, and the new communist government was still consolidating power. The People's Liberation Army, while large and experienced in guerrilla warfare, had little modern equipment and no air force to speak of. Fighting the United States, the world's most powerful military with atomic weapons, seemed suicidal. But Mao ultimately decided that intervention was necessary. He feared that a hostile, American-occupied Korea would threaten Chinese security permanently. He worried that failing to assist a communist ally would damage China's standing in the communist world. He believed, perhaps correctly, that if China did not fight in Korea, it would eventually have to fight closer to home in worse circumstances. The Chinese intervention began in mid-October, even before Pyongyang fell, but it proceeded in secret and was not detected by American intelligence. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops, organized as the People's Volunteer Army, to maintain the fiction that this was not an official Chinese state action, crossed the Yalu River at night, and concealed themselves in the Korean mountains during the day. They moved without vehicles, communicating by bugle and whistle instead of radio, dispersing into small groups that avoided aerial detection. By late October, nearly 300,000 Chinese soldiers were in North Korea, waiting in concealment as UN forces advanced past their positions, extending their supply lines and separating their units. The trap was set. Chinese forces launched their first attacks in late October, hitting isolated South Korean and American units with overwhelming numbers in sudden nighttime assaults. These initial engagements were sharp and violent, resulting in UN forces being mauled or overrun. But then the Chinese forces disengaged and disappeared back into the mountains. MacArthur and his intelligence staff convinced themselves that these engagements represented only a limited intervention by Chinese volunteers, not the beginning of a major offensive. They estimated that perhaps 30,000 to 40,000 Chinese troops had crossed the border, enough to be a nuisance, but not enough to reverse the UN advance. This catastrophic intelligence failure was driven partly by overconfidence and partly by the difficulty of detecting an enemy that moved only at night and avoided using modern communications. MacArthur ordered his forces to continue the offensive. On November 24th, he launched what he called the final push to end the war, aiming to reach the Yalu River along its entire length and complete the conquest of North Korea. The attack advanced into the teeth of the Chinese trap. That evening, as UN forces celebrated Thanksgiving with turkey dinners flown in from Japan, the Chinese were preparing to spring their trap. 2 days later, 300,000 Chinese soldiers attacked along the entire front in a coordinated offensive that shattered UN lines and transformed victory into catastrophic defeat. The Chinese offensive that began on November 25, 1950, was overwhelming in its scale and ferocity. Across the frozen mountains of North Korea, Chinese forces emerged from concealment and attacked UN positions with massive numerical superiority. They struck at night, using bugles and whistles to coordinate movements and create psychological terror. They infiltrated between UN units, attacking from unexpected directions and cutting supply lines. The Chinese tactics emphasized infiltration, encirclement, and close combat that negated American advantages in artillery and air power. Within hours, entire UN units were surrounded and fighting for survival. The 8th Army on the western side of the peninsula and the X-Corps on the eastern side both found themselves engulfed in a disaster. The massive Chinese intervention had caught the UN command completely by surprise, and the shock was compounded by the realization that UN forces were outnumbered, outflanked, and in imminent danger of complete destruction. The retreat from North Korea became one of the most harrowing episodes in American military history. UN forces had to fight their way south through Chinese encirclements while dealing with brutal winter weather that saw temperatures drop to 20 degrees below zero. Equipment froze and malfunctioned. Soldiers suffered frostbite and exposure. Medical supplies ran short. The Chinese forces pressed the retreating UN columns relentlessly, attacking flanks and rear guards, ambushing convoys, and overrunning isolated positions. The 8th Army conducted a fighting withdrawal down the western side of the peninsula, abandoning Pyongyang on December 5th and continuing south. The retreat was conducted with enough discipline to prevent complete collapse, but it was nonetheless a humiliating reversal. On the eastern side, the 1st Marine Division and other X-Corps units faced an even more desperate situation, surrounded at the Chosin Reservoir in some of the most inhospitable terrain in Korea. The breakout from the Chosin Reservoir would become legendary in Marine Corps history, though it was born from a tactical disaster. The 1st Marine Division, along with Army units and British Royal Marine Commandos, found itself encircled by overwhelming Chinese forces in mountainous terrain in the dead of winter. The only escape route was a single narrow road that wound through mountain passes, perfect terrain for ambush. The breakout began on December 6th and continued for 2 weeks of continuous combat in temperatures that reached -35 degrees Fahrenheit. The Marines fought their way south in a mobile battle, attacking in every direction to break through Chinese forces blocking the road. They brought their dead and wounded with them, refusing to leave anyone behind despite the tactical difficulties this created. When a reporter suggested the Marines were retreating, the division commander, Major General Oliver Smith, famously replied that they were not retreating, but advancing in a different direction. The Chosin breakout was a tactical success in that the division survived intact and reached the coast for evacuation, but the strategic picture remained catastrophic. UN forces were in full retreat from North Korea, and the war had been transformed overnight. By late December, UN forces had been driven entirely out of North Korea and were retreating in South Korea as well. Seoul fell to Chinese and North Korean forces on January 4, 1951, for the second time in the war. The front lines that had been near the Chinese border in late November were now south of the South Korean capital. In barely 6 weeks, UN forces had retreated more than 300 miles. The stunning victory at Inchon and the advance to the Yalu now seemed like a fevered dream. MacArthur, so confident in October, was now openly discussing the possibility that UN forces might be driven entirely off the peninsula. He cabled Washington with increasingly dire assessments and increasingly extreme proposals. The theater commander, who had been preparing victory parades, was now contemplating evacuation and defeat. MacArthur's solution to the crisis was escalation. He proposed a series of measures that would dramatically expand the war. He wanted to blockade the Chinese coast and bomb industrial targets in Manchuria. He wanted to use nationalist Chinese forces from Taiwan to open a second front against mainland China. Most alarmingly, he proposed using atomic bombs against Chinese forces in Korea and against targets in China itself. MacArthur argued that the Korean War could not be won with the existing restrictions, that fighting a limited war against an enemy with sanctuary in China was a recipe for stalemate or defeat. He believed, and stated repeatedly, that in war there is no substitute for victory, and victory required taking the war to China itself. These proposals horrified the Truman administration and military leadership in Washington, but they also reflected a genuine strategic dilemma about how to respond to the Chinese intervention. The possibility of using atomic weapons in Korea was seriously debated in Washington during the winter of 1950 and 1951. President Truman himself created a media firestorm at a press conference on November 30th when he stated that the use of atomic weapons had always been under consideration and that the military commander in the field would be responsible for their use. Truman was trying to signal resolve to China and the Soviet Union, but his comments sparked panic among European allies who feared that the Korean War was spiraling toward World War III. British Prime Minister Clement Attlee flew to Washington to urge restraint, arguing that using nuclear weapons in Korea would alienate allies, hand the Soviet Union a propaganda victory, and risk Soviet retaliation in Europe. The Truman administration ultimately rejected the use of atomic weapons in Korea, concluding that there were no suitable targets, that using nuclear weapons against Asian enemies so soon after Hiroshima and Nagasaki would appear racist, and that it risked Soviet countermeasures that could lead to general war. The Soviet role in the Korean War remained carefully limited throughout the conflict, but the potential for Soviet intervention created the specter of World War III. Stalin provided equipment, advisors, and eventually air support to the Chinese and North Koreans. Soviet pilots flew MiG-15 fighters from bases in China, engaging American aircraft in history's first jet-versus-jet combat, though they wore Chinese uniforms and operated under strict orders not to speak Russian on the radio. Soviet air defense units were deployed to protect Chinese cities. Soviet submarines operated in the Pacific. But Stalin carefully avoided actions that would directly commit Soviet forces in a way that could not be denied. He wanted to bleed the United States in Korea, tie down American forces and resources, and demonstrate the limits of American power. But he did not want a direct US-Soviet war that could go nuclear. The risk was that escalatory moves by either side, whether MacArthur's proposed attacks on China or Soviet overreach in support of its allies, could trigger a spiral that ended in general war. The world's two nuclear-armed superpowers were facing each other indirectly in Korea, and the danger of miscalculation was acute. The winter crisis in Korea created genuine fear that the conflict would expand into a global war. MacArthur's public statements became increasingly insubordinate, directly contradicting administration policy and calling for measures that the president had rejected. The general, who had been a national hero in October, was becoming a political liability by January. The Truman administration faced withering Republican criticism for its handling of the war. Critics charged that the administration had invited aggression through weakness, bungled the intelligence on Chinese intervention, and was now losing a war that had seemed won. Senator Joseph McCarthy and other Republican politicians used Korea to attack Truman and the Democrats as soft on communism. The political pressure to escalate, to use all available means including nuclear weapons to avoid defeat, was intense. But Truman and his advisors, particularly Secretary of State Dean Acheson and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, held to the position that Korea was not the place for a showdown with the communist powers, that Europe remained the vital strategic theater, and that the United States could not afford to be drawn into a wider Asian war that would benefit the Soviet Union. The military situation stabilized in early 1951, not through escalation, but through determined conventional defense. Lieutenant General Matthew Ridgway, who had taken command of the 8th Army in December following the death of the previous commander, reorganized UN forces and restored their fighting spirit. Ridgway emphasized aggressive patrolling, better use of artillery and air power, and mobile defense rather than trying to hold fixed lines. Under his leadership, UN forces stopped retreating in mid-January. Then, methodically, they began pushing north again. Chinese and North Korean forces, now extended beyond their supply lines and exhausted from weeks of continuous combat, could not sustain their offensive. By March, UN forces had recaptured Seoul for the second time. By April, the front lines had stabilized near the 38th parallel, where the war had begun. The situation had returned to a geographic stalemate, but the political and strategic landscape had been transformed by 4 months of disasters and near catastrophe. The climax of the civil-military crisis came in April 1951 when President Truman fired General MacArthur. The general's public insubordination had become intolerable. MacArthur had continued to advocate publicly for expanding the war into China in direct contradiction of administration policy. He had communicated with Republican congressional leaders to build support for his strategy. Most egregiously, after Truman had drafted a statement exploring the possibility of negotiations, MacArthur issued his own public statement threatening to expand the war and essentially sabotaging any diplomatic initiative. Truman concluded that MacArthur was undermining civilian control of the military and threatening the constitutional principle that the president determines policy. On April 11th, Truman relieved MacArthur of command and replaced him with Ridgway. The decision created a political firestorm. MacArthur returned to the United States for the first time in 14 years and received a hero's welcome. He addressed a joint session of Congress and delivered his famous farewell speech quoting the old military ballad that old soldiers never die, they just fade away. Public opinion initially sided heavily with MacArthur against Truman, but Senate hearings on the dismissal allowed the Joint Chiefs of Staff to testify that MacArthur's proposals were militarily unsound and risked general war. Gradually, the political crisis subsided, and MacArthur did indeed fade from the political scene, though the Korean War ground on. The dismissal of MacArthur and the stabilization of the front lines near the 38th parallel in spring 1951 marked a fundamental shift in the character of the Korean War. What had been a war of movement, with dramatic advances and retreats covering hundreds of miles, became a war of attrition along relatively static lines. Neither side could achieve a decisive military breakthrough without risking escalation that could lead to general war. The Chinese and North Koreans could not push UN forces off the peninsula. UN forces could advance north again, but doing so risked another massive Chinese intervention, and there was no longer any appetite in Washington for pursuing total victory. The result was a grinding stalemate that resembled the trench warfare of World War I more than the mobile operations that had characterized 1950. The war would continue for 2 more years in this mode, consuming lives and resources while diplomats explored the possibility of an armistice. Negotiations for a ceasefire began in July 1951 at the town of Kaesong, later moving to Panmunjom. The talks would drag on for 2 years, becoming almost as grueling and frustrating as the combat they were meant to end. The fundamental issues were straightforward in principle, but devilishly difficult in practice. Where would the final demarcation line be drawn? What would happen to prisoners of war? Would foreign forces be withdrawn from Korea? How would the armistice be supervised and enforced? Each of these questions became a prolonged negotiation, with both sides using military pressure to strengthen their bargaining position. The front lines during this period remained relatively stable, but fighting continued daily. Artillery duels were constant, patrols clashed in no man's land. Both sides conducted limited offensives to seize tactically important terrain features like hilltops that offered observation of enemy positions. These battles for obscure hills, with numbers instead of names, consumed thousands of lives for objectives that had no strategic significance beyond their value in the attrition calculus. The issue that ultimately prolonged the negotiations most was the question of prisoners of war. The United Nations Command held approximately 170,000 prisoners, most of them North Korean, but including significant numbers of Chinese. The Communist side held roughly 10,000 UN prisoners, mostly American and South Korean. Under the Geneva Convention, all prisoners were supposed to be repatriated at the end of hostilities. But UN interrogations revealed that many prisoners, particularly Chinese soldiers who had been nationalist troops before being impressed into communist forces, did not want to return to communist control. The Truman administration, for both humanitarian and propaganda reasons, insisted on voluntary repatriation. Prisoners would be given a choice, and those who did not want to return would not be forced to do so. The communist negotiators regarded this position as outrageous, arguing that it violated international law and was merely a cover for propaganda purposes. They demanded that all prisoners be returned regardless of individual wishes. The voluntary repatriation issue deadlocked the negotiations for more than a year. While diplomats argued, soldiers continued dying in what had become a war of attrition along fortified lines. Both sides constructed elaborate trench systems, bunkers, and defensive positions that stretched across the peninsula. Combat devolved into a grim routine of artillery bombardments, patrol actions, and periodic assaults on hilltop positions. The fighting during the static phase of the war lacked the drama of the Inchon landing or the Chosin Reservoir, but it was no less lethal. Battles for hills like Old Baldy, Porkchop Hill, and Heartbreak Ridge produced casualty lists that would have been considered catastrophic in any other context, but which barely registered in public consciousness because they produced no dramatic changes in the military situation. Soldiers on both sides lived in conditions reminiscent of World War I, enduring mud, cold, disease, and the constant threat of sudden death from artillery or sniper fire, all while knowing that the war was stalemated and that their sacrifice would not produce victory. The political landscape shifted significantly with the U.S. presidential election of 1952. The Korean War had become deeply unpopular with the American public, who saw their sons dying in a stalemated conflict with no clear purpose and no end in sight. The war was a major liability for the Democratic Party. Republican candidate Dwight Eisenhower, the former Supreme Allied Commander in Europe during World War II, promised that if elected, he would go to Korea personally to end the war. Eisenhower won in a landslide. He did visit Korea in December 1952, though the trip produced no immediate breakthrough. But Eisenhower's election did create conditions for eventual armistice. The new administration was less invested in the negotiating positions that had deadlocked the talks, and Eisenhower was willing to use threats of escalation to pressure the communist side. The administration quietly signaled through diplomatic channels that if negotiations remained stalemated, the United States might use nuclear weapons or expand the war into China. Whether these threats were credible or whether other factors were more important remains debated, but the negotiating dynamic shifted in early 1953. The death of Joseph Stalin on March 5, 1953, removed another obstacle to armistice. Stalin had encouraged the North Korean invasion and supported continuing the war as a means of bleeding American resources and demonstrating American limitations. His successors in the collective leadership were less committed to the Korean conflict and more focused on domestic and European issues. The new Soviet leadership signaled support for ending the war. Chinese casualties had been enormous, possibly exceeding 1 million dead and wounded. and the economic cost of sustaining armies in Korea was significant. China, too, was ready for an armistice. Even Kim Il-sung, who had started the war with dreams of quick reunification and whose forces had come close to achieving it twice, recognized that continuing the war indefinitely would not produce victory. The combination of Stalin's death, Eisenhower's veiled threats, and mutual exhaustion created conditions for agreement. The final breakthrough came on the prisoner issue when the communist side accepted a compromise involving neutral nations supervising the repatriation process and allowing prisoners to make choices without direct coercion by either side. On July 27, 1953, 3 years and 1 month after the war began, representatives signed an armistice agreement at Panmunjom. The agreement established a demilitarized zone roughly along the existing front lines, which remained close to the 38th parallel, though with adjustments based on the final military positions. All active hostilities would cease. Prisoners would be exchanged in a process supervised by neutral nations. A military armistice commission would supervise implementation. Notably, the agreement was an armistice, not a peace treaty. It ended the fighting, but did not formally end the state of war. No political settlement regarding Korea's future was reached. The two Korean states remained in existence, both claiming sovereignty over the entire peninsula, both maintaining large armies and viewing each other with hostility. The cost of the Korean War was staggering. Approximately 40,000 American military personnel died, along with several thousand from other UN contingent nations. South Korean military deaths exceeded 130,000, and South Korean civilian deaths may have reached 1 million or more. North Korean military and civilian deaths combined probably exceeded 1.5 million. Chinese casualties were enormous, with estimates ranging from 400,000 to over 1 million dead, depending on the source. Millions of Koreans became refugees. Entire cities were reduced to rubble by bombing and artillery. The peninsula's infrastructure was devastated. Families were divided by the demarcation line, unable to reunite for decades. The war left a legacy of bitterness and trauma that shaped Korean society and politics for generations. And despite all this sacrifice, the war ended, with the peninsula still divided close to where it had been divided in 1945, with two hostile states facing each other across a militarized border. The Korean War established patterns and precedents that defined the Cold War for decades afterward. It demonstrated that the United States would use military force to contain communist expansion, but within limits. The Truman administration's decision to fight a limited war rather than risk general war with China and the Soviet Union, despite intense political pressure for escalation, set a pattern that would recur in Vietnam and other Cold War conflicts. The war showed that nuclear weapons, while they created an existential threat, did not necessarily translate into usable military power in limited conflicts. The decision not to use atomic weapons in Korea, despite serious consideration, established a taboo against nuclear use that has held to the present day. The war validated the United Nations' capacity to organize collective security operations, though it also revealed the organization's limitations when great powers have direct interests at stake. For Korea itself, the war created a division that has lasted 70 years and continues to the present day. The armistice line became one of the most heavily militarized borders in the world, with over 1 million troops facing each other across the demilitarized zone. The DMZ itself became a bizarre monument to frozen conflict, a strip of land 2.5 miles wide and 160 miles long that has remained largely untouched by human activity since 1953 and has inadvertently become a nature preserve. The two Korean states developed along radically different paths. South Korea eventually transitioned to democracy and developed into one of the world's most advanced economies. North Korea remained under the Kim family's totalitarian rule and developed nuclear weapons, while its people suffered periodic famines. The Korean War technically never ended. The armistice remains in effect, but no peace treaty has ever been signed. North and South Korea remain legally at war, and the United States maintains thousands of troops in South Korea as a deterrent against renewed aggression. The Korean War came terrifyingly close to triggering World War III at multiple points. The Chinese intervention in November 1950 created a genuine possibility of direct US-China war that could have drawn in the Soviet Union through its alliance with China. MacArthur's proposals to bomb China and use atomic weapons, if implemented, would likely have led to Soviet retaliation and general war. The presence of Soviet pilots fighting American pilots in Mig Alley created daily risks of escalation. The nuclear threats made during the Eisenhower administration, even if mostly bluff, carried risks of miscalculation. That the war remained limited and did not escalate to global conflict was not inevitable. It required repeated decisions by leaders in Washington, Moscow, and Beijing to exercise restraint even when domestic political pressures pushed toward escalation. The war demonstrated both the dangers of proxy conflicts between nuclear powers and the possibility of keeping such conflicts limited through deliberate policy choices. The Korean War deserves its description as the forgotten war, at least in American and Western memory. It occurred between the epic struggle of World War II and the traumatic quagmire of Vietnam, and it lacks the clear narrative arc of either. It produced no decisive victory or defeat, just an inconclusive armistice that preserved the status quo. It lacked the moral clarity of World War II's fight against fascism. Its limited nature frustrated Americans who were used to total victory. The war has been overshadowed in collective memory, remembered primarily by veterans and historians, while the broader public remains largely ignorant of its details. But forgetting this war is dangerous, because the Korean War established the dynamics of Cold War confrontation, demonstrated the risks of limited wars between nuclear-armed powers, and created a still unresolved division that remains one of the world's most dangerous flashpoints. The war that almost started World War III did not end in 1953. It merely paused. And the pause has lasted 70 years with no resolution in sight. If you found this deep dive into one of history's most dangerous forgotten conflicts compelling, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. We bring you extensively researched documentary content on war stories and spy operations that shaped our world. There are dozens more stories of conflict, espionage, and geopolitical brinkmanship waiting for you in our catalog. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when we post new content. Your support through likes, comments, and shares helps us continue producing in-depth, historical documentaries. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.